all the information, or I guess it was complicated. Anyway, long story. They applied the DCD, so-called DCD wall capacity pressures, which are one design condition, and they also applied the DCD envelope pressures. There's two, right? For the reactor building, there's the so-called wall capacity pressures, which are the equivalent pressures that you would need in order to get stability. And then there's another set of results that are the DCD also called design pressures, I believe is what they call them, that they are basically what they get as an envelope of ASCE 498 pressures and the SASE pressures. And so what they did is they applied those pressures on the same model that you're developing and got bending moments and shears, and so they had an apples-to-apples comparison of bending moments and shears. Is that what you're doing?
Basically, before what in the DCD was done, we take the partial result. There's one set of flows, one with a static pressure, and we apply that on the wall and we see those bending moments and shears.
Yeah, and you compare those bending moments and shears to what?
To the DCD one.
Because the DCD doesn't really document that.
And just check. Right, they have that in the technical report.
Oh, you have that? Okay. All right, so you're doing something different. Okay. All right, I just wanted to clarify that.
For C, we already have some results for the lateral structure, for the central building, and after doing shear building. So basically, so far what we have as a preliminary result that standard design interval of the lateral structure, whenever we include the pressure, actually, the pressures are getting smaller, as we will show in the next slide. And yeah, we can go to the next slide basically to illustrate that. Those are the results that we wrote in the building. And as you can see, when you have the pressure included, all these sharp peaks which were up and down, we go down, so smooth it out. And as you can see, like that, low angle, like PCB, have the pressure actually. And those are results we see constantly.
So, what is it we're comparing? The red versus the green, right?
Yes. The red is the partially embedded, the green are embedded.
Okay.
And then you have the DCD as well.
Okay.
Actually in blue, I think. I think this is what I would expect to be.
So now basically, right.
Yeah, that you have down maybe the basement level.
Okay, so they go down. The peak just gets smoothed down.
It's a numerical. It's got like a EM high speed. The soil elements that improve that actually the solution.
But it also goes up a little bit just above the baseline, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so going back to my previous question, that vertical blue line, which is the DCD, is that the wall capacity pressure, or is that the design pressure?
For the DCD, what they did, the walls were designed for the blue line.
Yeah.
Then, when they did the sliding analysis, they calculated the required pressure, the stability,
Yep.
wall capacity.
I think they call it wall capacity pressure.
Then they did check that those are also the standard design can withstand. They never combine them together because they're kind of separate. You cannot have the passive.
So this is the design pressure. So these are the pressures that I would find in Appendix 3A of the DCD.
They are in the report because I worked with the PCB.
Okay, no, I think I know what they are. Okay.
Also, I think we discussed within the short period, Modern, the review, then what we said we found out is that these models is documented in the technical report. Same like the department. So we have much more detail. And also later on those results of the fully embedded models.
One thing I would suggest, if fully embedded model gives you higher response, okay, some reason or other, then you need to have that as a design basis in the FSA.
We will cover that.
And also cover in detail how you did it, what, because initially we were pretty much looking at the sensitivity, the way we look at sensitivity study. Now in this situation, if it is a design basis, then it has to have lower bound case, upper bound case, whatever, best estimate, that has to be documented.
Right, I will cover it later.
Okay.
Okay, so before we go to question 38, it's a little after 11, and we had said that we'd go back and cover what is it, 37112, that RAI. Jim, is it on?
Yeah. Hi, Gina. We're on.
Yep.
Okay. So we're going back to the slide for 37112, which I think is around 19. Okay.
Who are we talking to on the line?
So now we're talking Nick Greger and Jim Maroney have joined us. Is anyone else joined? Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so Nick, you're going to lead the discussion, is that right?
Yeah, I'll go into that. So, good morning, and thanks for accommodating our West Coast time frame out here and having us get in at 8 o'clock instead of 5:30. I'm assuming that you guys are looking at slide 19, which is just basically we're going to pose the 371-12 REI question. And it's broken into three parts, A, B, and C. So for part A, the question basically was to provide the complete information of the spectral matching criteria and show that we satisfy those spectral matching criteria in items A through D. So A is talking about the Nyquist frequency, the total length of the record. B is how many points per frequency decade in the target spectrum. C is actually a bunch of statistical checks, like you can have no more than 9 consecutive points that fall below the target and some other limits. And then D is the issue of the PSD check. So the question is, first of all, to provide that information. There's a second part of this question, which we'll go into a little bit later, and that is whether any safety-related SSCs fall below the frequency range of 0.2 hertz, and if so, sort of provide justification that it's acceptable. So if we go to the next slide, then we'll just continue on going over the REI questions, and then we'll get into the response. Slide 20 then is part B and C. So for part B, what's been asked of us is to provide the PSD functions of the time histories and discuss whether there's any significant dips in the PSDs. And then part C is having to do with the baseline correction procedure, and as I'll talk about in sort of our response in the next couple of slides, is that can influence sort of your modification to the acceleration response spectra, and so the sequential order that you do the baseline correction during the spectral matching process can impact sort of your statistical checks of the response spectra to your target at the end of the day. So that's sort of the outline of the REI-12. And then if we go to the next slide, we'll sort of get into our responses and what we propose to do for the response. So as I mentioned, for the first part, Part A, the first part of Part A, we've been asked to provide more information. What we have provided in the FSR are some information for the time history, the match time histories, things like the cross correlation to show that it's less than 0.16. And as well, we've provided a graphical comparison of our response spectra of our baseline corrected spectrum compatible time history with the target and plus or minus bounds of less than 10% below or 30% above. what we propose to do in our response now is to provide the additional information that's being requested. And we don't plan on updating the FSAR with this information, but it will all be contained in the response to the REI. So going through the items A through D, the first one, as I had mentioned, is dealing with the time step, the Nyquist frequency, and the length of the record. So all of our time series have a time step of 0.005 seconds, and that would equate to a Nyquist frequency of 100 hertz. And so the requirements say at least 50 hertz. We've exceeded that. We're up to 100 hertz. And then as well, in Part A of the SRP 371 matching criteria, they talk about having a total time length of the record of at least 20 seconds, and our time records are actually 30 seconds in length, so those are the requirements of Part A that we're satisfying. For Part B, other requirements, they talk about having a minimum of 100 frequencies per decade on the target spectrum when you do the matching, and we do that. We match, we take our target spectrum and we interpolate it such that we get 100 points per spectral frequency decade. Then for Part C, this is what you can't see in the plots that we provide in the FSAR, but we will statistically list these values, and that is things like no more than 9 consecutive points that fall below the target, and as well sort of the average ratio between the target and your match time history has to be greater than 1. And so we'll provide all those informations for all of the time histories we've developed in a table form as part of the response. But as I mentioned, we weren't planning to update the FSAR to put this detailed information in the FSAR, but just deal with it as a response to the REI. And then finally, the last part is Part D of the spectrometric criteria, which is the PSD plots. And I'll get into a little bit more of that in the next couple of slides. So if we go to the next slide, which should be slide 22, in dealing with the PSD issue, as we mentioned here, there are 2 points, and one is in the FSAR, we actually state that for the horizontal cases, we have compared the PSD of the match time histories with what we're calling the reference PSD, following the methodology and the data contained in Appendix B of the SRP 371. And in all those cases, we don't fall below 80% of that reference PSD, which is a requirement. But I should mention that in the SRP, the requirement in Part D of the spectral matching criteria of Option 1 Approach 2 only requires you to compute the PSD and show the PSD if your match is greater than 30% above your target. And in all of our matches, we don't exceed that. So one of the reasons we didn't put it in the FSAR is because the current SRP doesn't require us to do that, since we're falling in the cases where we don't exceed 30% of our matches. There is a draft SRP, as everyone knows, it's out there for comment. It's been out there for comment for a while now, and in discussions we've had before, there's a potential that that will be reissued for more commentary before it gets submitted and accepted as a final current SRP. And in that, there's discussion and a commentary where there's criteria of only when you exceed 30% of your target match do you need to show the PSD to require you to show the PSD. So what we plan to do is, like I said before, we have a statement in the FSAR right now indicating that we don't fall below this 80% limit of the PSD, but we're now going to include the plots, and not just for the horizontal, but as well for the vertical. And we'll put some language in there as well, showing that, you know, we do see some undulations in the PSD, as you would expect, because these aren't smooth hard rock spectra that we're matching to, but they're actually FIRS. But we don't feel that any of those peaks and valleys are significant in terms of looking at energy gaps in the time histories that we developed. Going to the next slide is just a continuation that I had mentioned that we state currently in the FSAR that we don't fall below this 80% limit. And what we'll do as our response is not only deal with that in the response, but as well, as I mentioned, put these plots showing the PSDs for the time histories in the updated revision to the FSAR. Then the other part I should mention, I don't know if, I think I unfortunately skipped over, is the issue with the SSEs, any SSEs with responses less than 0.2 hertz. And what we plan to do for our response is, first of all, there are 2 sloshing modes with 2 pools that do have frequencies less than 0.2 hertz. The one's at 0.166 and one's at 0.091 hertz, so less than 0.2 hertz. But we plan to provide justification that even though the time histories are low out there, the CSDRS spectrum is enveloping the target spectrum, and so we'll justify that it's acceptable in this case. Then finally, going to slide 24, This is the last part of the REI-12, and this has to do with the fact of the baseline correction procedure in the spectral matching procedure. So as part of the spectral matching procedure, it's an iterative process that we go through, and after each iteration of this, we do a baseline correction to remove any long period drift that can be introduced in the spectral matching procedure. When you do remove this long period drift, there's a potential to adjust and modify just based on the baseline correction your acceleration response spectra, especially out at the lower frequencies. And so to assure ourselves that we're not doing this baseline correction after we've checked the criteria, the matching criteria, what we do is we do the baseline correction at the very end one last time, and then we take the baseline corrected time history, compute its acceleration response vector, and use that to compare it against the target and do all statistical checks. And so this assures us that the time histories we show in the FSAR and the time histories that we end up giving for future analysis downstream are actually baseline corrected time histories that are consistent with an acceleration response spectra that we use for the spectral matching checks. And so it's a very good question, and if you do things out of order, you can get some disconnects between what you're giving as a time history and as well as what you're giving as far as your statistical checks to the target. The other thing is that we do the baseline correction such that if someone were to take the acceleration time history and do a simple integration of the domain, you would get the same velocity and displacement records that we show in the FSAR.
Okay, Nick, this is Vladimir. I'm sorry, I missed a couple of phrases that you said.
Sure.
Can you speak a little bit more loudly and repeat the last couple of phrases, please?
Sure. And so this is just with Part C, Vladimir, the time history baseline correction?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. I should have asked if everyone could hear me clearly at the very beginning. Sorry if I blew over through things and people didn't hear me. So to get to this discussion on this, so the baseline correction procedure is applied at the very end as well as during the iterative process of the spectral matching. And so after we get what we consider to be an acceptable match, we do one last baseline correction, and then from that baseline corrected time history, we recompute the acceleration response spectra to recheck to make sure we're satisfying the criteria. So we don't have a disconnect where we might have checked and say we're acceptable and then do another baseline correction and never go back and recheck it, because that baseline correction, as you know, Vladimir, can adjust the response spectra in some frequency ranges. So the final time histories that we send forward for future calculations has been baseline corrected, and the response spectra and the velocity and displacement time histories from that baseline corrected time history are consistent in the sense we don't have another baseline correction, and there won't be any long period drift if you were to take the acceleration record and do an integration to get velocity and displacement.
Thank you. Yes, that's exactly the question. Yes.
Okay.
I have a question. Can you go back and tell, what did you find below 0.2 hertz and how are you going to address them?
I can help with that. Basically, we went through all the components and equipment, and we discovered only the two pools in the reactor building, fuel building, for which the flushing pressure, flushing mass has a frequency below 0.2 hertz. All the rest was above that frequency. So the only calculations which will be affected by having frequency below 0.2 hertz are the flushing pressures from these two pools. Now, in order to address this...
And sloshing height, maybe.
Right.
Let's show you height.
Now, we went back and what we did, we compared the CFDRS at that location with the first, and with all the variation. We have 30% plus and 10 minus for fitting. And then for those low frequencies, the standard design is the one that governs. Basically, the standard design pressures will envelope the site-specific pressures.
Okay, but the site-specific SSC is the design basis also for you. So what are you going to do about that?
I mean, for that particular load or component, because there are two of them as design basis, the standard design specs envelopes it. I mean, it provides adequate design. Yes. So basically, we have net spectra, which is the time history, which is meets the requirements. We will still the DCD will be the one that will govern the design. So.
But the analysis is performed separately, right? It performed one analysis for that both whenever they have squashing below 0.4 hertz. You use the entire spectrum to do the analysis. You don't use the combined CSDRS and the first edition. I think you're not combining the two inputs. You are doing one input at a time for analysis.
Right, but this is not really equipment qualification or design question. These pressures are actually local pressures on the pool walls that we consider. Basically, this will just confirm further that the standard design envelopes of the pool walls envelopes the demands from Northern.
But you find that this washing for your site-specific analysis is higher, whatever input you are using. But that is that pressure carb.
But he's saying it's not.
Slashing and impulsive mode, right?
Right.
Very low.
The combined
Low frequency.
Correct.
So when you combine the two modes of full structure fraction, the sloshing effect, if you use a specific input, is underestimated. Are you proposing to use the DC input for the sloshing mode and recombine them?
Yes, there won't be.
That's not what they said on the front.
Yeah, right. Basically, the load. I mean, the slashing portion of the load is so small. Right. Yes.
Showing near the surface.
Right. Yes. And then I believe also the amplitude or the height of the slashing is also a function of the speaker. So if you have DCD input, you will have higher height. So both the pressure and the height are involved.
Okay.
Yeah, but
I do want to add something though. I believe that when the person was on the phone, he mentioned some comparisons to PSD targets. My comment is that there shouldn't be PSD targets because the only PSD targets that are currently in the SRP have been significantly revised. So I don't think
Yeah, it's true that we understand that the data provided in the Appendix B of the SRP is questionable in a sense, but we followed a methodology that's similar to the site response amplification factors to try and adjust those factors. So it's just as easy that we can provide just the plots of the PSD without this reference PSD, so we're not calling them target PSDs, we're just calling them reference PSDs. So that's easy enough. We can remove those other curves in the comparisons and just provide plots of the PSD if that's probably a better way to go about it.
probably a better way because those so-called reference PSDs, I think, are quite a bit underestimated.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions on that one? No? Any other questions? No. You. I don't have it. You don't have question, Bill.
Nick, thank you. You did a great job. And Jim, thank you for your support. So y'all are welcome to stay on the phone or hang up, and we'll talk with you another day.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, what's next?
So to slide 41, if Jim, it's you're just going to present that.
Sure. And this skip Schumann's with the Hitachi. We're on question 38438 alpha silica reaction. And again, this is a question about the information notice 2011-20. And so the response we're going to say, and it's a little different the way it's worded up there, is we're going to implement the ASTM testing standards for concrete aggregate under the seismic category 1 structures, and we'll have to revise the FSAR to reference these ASTM standards.
What category?
Again, there's granular decks, or there's engineered fill right now, but yes, I suspect that would probably be considered.
It should be considered.
This is all. Yeah. Again, the thing we said redness here, which isn't really. I mean, structures containing like the appropriate redness equipment, but they are seismic category 2. So yeah.
It's just all concrete below grade, right?
Yeah.
Not for all concrete. Concrete below grade.
Yeah.
So you're saying the structural concrete?
Yeah. I mean, that's the big concern. It's concrete below grade.
My understanding that it's good that we're having this discussion because, Bernie had this question from the NRC, not as an RII, but as a discussion, and the vice president. They put the information in section 254, which is...
Right, but I mean...
But again, did the information notice limit to low grade? I don't remember.
Let me just explain what the issue is. There's this thing that's called outside silica reaction that it takes a really long time to develop. People will not notice it until like 20 years down the line, and it's due to the fact that the cement chemically interacts with certain types of coarse aggregates. And so there are certain tests that have been there for a very long time that supposedly check for this. What the information notice basically explains is that those tests that are currently in the ASME code or in the ACI 349 code may not be enough. But there's better, more up-to-date tests that are not in those standards and that are the ones that should be used to check for this condition. That's basically what's in the information notice. So all we're asking is
all concrete, so not just a below grade. That's because this issue was identified in a certain operating reaction.
Right.
That's the lessons learned.
Right. And the condition occurs whenever concrete is in presence of water, groundwater. That's why it's mostly a concern for below grade concrete. But Jim is right, because it's really for Cat 1 concrete. As in, I believe in the Fermi update, where they added those not just to but actually to standards like the.
Yes, right, chapter 1, the table.
Right, so those apply to everything. It's not just,
Well, just be careful how you read that.
Basically, the issue is that if you just leave everything as it is now, the standards that are applicable to concrete in general, are ACI 349 and ASME, the ASME code. If you look at what construction testing specifications are incorporated into those standards, those are not sufficient to detect this issue.
I understand what you're saying. It's just interesting because it sounds like what you all are saying, and we can do this, but it sounds like what you all are saying is that you are asking us to apply a new standard to standard design, BCD content.
My name's Lee Tiernan, I'm a chef. I'm here in sunny Miami, Florida, in Austin, Texas, and today I'm going to show you how to make...
BCD didn't have this.
That's my point.
This came to
is my point. But it's basically... Yeah, or are you doing it that you think you're saying, well...
Why didn't the BCD lose that?
But that's my point. if you're saying we should be applying this to anything other than concrete fill, then you're saying we should be applying it to the standard design. And I'm asking